So the COVID pandemic has been gone for a bit now, but I still get questions about the USA CARES Act that was put into effect right at the beginning of the pandemic. Does it still have an effect on evictions in the present day? The answer may surprise you. We're talking all about that 30-day notice requirement and whether it applies to your property. Let's get started. So it's important that we understand the difference between state law and federal law. Across the 50 states, there are variations on how evictions take place. I do my work in Texas, and so I tend to speak from a Texas perspective. But the USA CARES Act, which was signed into law during the first Trump administration on March 27th, 2020, is federal law that applies equally across the board to all 50 states. This means that it doesn't really matter what the state says. The new minimum standard in certain situations at the time that the act was in place was whatever was in that CARES Act. And I want to talk to you a little bit about it and what remnants of it continue to linger for eviction trials in present day. So the part of the CARES Act that we're the most concerned with is Section 4024. Specifically, there are three parts to it that we're going to take a look at today. Part A has to do with the definitions of terms in the act itself. Part B has to do with that pesky moratorium. And Part C has to do with notice. So I'm going to talk about Part B first, because that's the part that is in fact dead and gone. In fact, the act had a specific 120-day time limit for the moratorium. And for those of you who don't remember, when this act was signed into law, it was just as the outbreak began, and the federal government put an absolute stop to all evictions for 120 days, beginning on March 27th, 2020, and extending for approximately 4 months. Which means that no, the moratorium is no longer in place. If you recall, the CDC later put a moratorium, but that was struck down as unconstitutional. This moratorium may have been struck down, but it was limited, and so it never really reached the courts, certainly not before the moratorium ended by its own terms. So we're left with the definition section and then the notice section. And before we get to the notice section, it's important to know whether or not your property is even what's referred to as a covered dwelling. Section 4024 subsection A defines a covered dwelling to mean a dwelling that is occupied by a tenant pursuant to a residential lease or without a lease or with a lease terminable under state law and is on or in a covered property. So essentially, this section of the CARES Act applies with occupied property that is occupied by a tenant and essentially for residential purposes. It's important to understand the distinction between residential property and commercial property. And just know that the CARES Act would not apply in the event of a commercial eviction. But which residential evictions might apply? Well, the Act goes on to define a covered property as one that is participating in a housing program or one that is subject to a federally backed loan. Now, this could be a standard 1 to 4 family home or a 5 or greater unit multi-family property, like an apartment complex. So the CARES Act defines a covered property as a property that's either participating in a federally funded housing program or a property that's subject to a federally backed loan. And this is a section that tends to bring up the most questions when I talk to people about their rental properties and ask if they have a federally backed loan. Most people really don't know. The easiest way for you to determine whether you have a federally backed loan is to refer to your loan documents. But you can also make a phone call to your lender and just ask the question, is this a federally backed loan or is this subject to some kind of federal backing? And the reason that it's absolutely essential for you to know is because of Section 4024 subsection C of the CARES Act. which says the following: the lessor of a covered dwelling unit may not require the tenant to vacate the covered dwelling unit before the date that is 30 days after the date on which the lessor provides the tenant with a notice to vacate. Now, in the state of Texas, you can technically give as little as a 1-day notice to vacate. That's not something that I recommend. I tend to recommend that landlords should give no fewer than 3 days, but state law can, in certain situations, allow as little as a 1-day notice to vacate. However, if your property is a covered dwelling, then you're required by federal law to give a 30-day notice to vacate before you can proceed with any state eviction matter. Landlords who have no idea whether their property is a covered dwelling under the definitions of the CARES Act might find themselves in an eviction lawsuit having to start the whole process over because their tenant makes a determination that they have a covered dwelling. Or if a tenant simply raises the issue and you're unable to answer the court definitively, the court may simply dismiss your case because the burden is always on you, the plaintiff, to prove that you had a right to send the notice that you actually sent. The fact that state law allows you to send a 1, 2, or 3-day notice, but you're not sure whether or not your loan is a federally backed loan, might put you in a tight spot in the eviction court. You're always better off knowing this ahead of time than waiting to find out at trial or hoping for the best. If you're still unsure whether your property is subject to the CARES Act and whether you're required to give a 30-day notice to vacate minimally in your situation, I strongly suggest that you reach out and speak to a legal professional in your jurisdiction who can give you the proper guidance and explain to you what the law says about your rental property. If you've enjoyed today's video, I ask that you give us a like. If you have any questions or comments, leave those for me below. I'll respond to them myself. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. For those of you who want to continue learning more about landlording, YouTube seems to think that this video right here is the next best option for you. Watch it, as well as all the other content we have on this channel. And until next time, landlords, happy leasing.